Hello and welcome. A lot of interesting work is done in academic institutions, particularly business schools like the one I'm sitting in, that's the Indian School of Business in Mohali. But how much of this work actually finds its way into real life, into real businesses, into institutions, into the way CEOs and managers actually define and execute corporate strategy? To discuss this and debate this, I'm joined by two interesting people, Pradeep Singh, CEO of ISB Mohali, that's right here, and Professor Rishikesha Krishnan, Director of IIM Indore, and they hopefully will help me debate this. So let's get the external to internal view. You're new to this world, Mr. Singh, and you've been here for 4 months. How do you see this, the two worlds and the linkages, that is academia and the real world?
Thank you, Govind. As you correctly point out, I'm very new, not only to the Indian School of Business, but to the academic world. I spent 17 years in the government, 18 years outside government in the private sector, and now in this academia. The way I, at the end of these 4 months, seem to be seeing this playing out, the Indian School of Business, like any institution, high quality institution in the world, is essentially concerned with three broad objectives: research, high quality education, teaching and learning, and outreach, making an impact, connecting with society, being useful. We are trying to achieve these three objectives through one principal instrument, which is the faculty. And as you know, and as we know in economics, it's always a challenge when you're trying to achieve multiple objectives to single instruments. And I find that playing itself out quite intensely, frankly, as I see the world around me. On the one hand, there is the very well-deserved focus on research, and research needs to be fundamental research needs to be applied research, and no one can underestimate the usefulness and value of research. And I think trying to say that you should be able to see an immediate application of research is really not understanding the nature of research. You know, interestingly enough, Rutherford, the father of nuclear physics in 1932, is supposed to be on record saying, I don't see any practical application of the work that I'm doing. Okay, so if he could get it wrong, certainly we can get it wrong. So we do need to invest in research, and we do need to acknowledge the importance of it. Now, what's happening is that, first of all, there is a very obvious problem. There are three challenges. One is that there is the whole issue of energy and attention and time that you can give to these three objectives. You know, there's limited time.
Sure.
So if the incentive structures, and that's where I think the rub is, the rub is that the incentive structures in high quality research driven schools seem to be almost entirely research linked, whereas the objectives are research, teaching, and impact.
Got it.
Right.
Okay, so let's
let me come back.
Yeah, let's pause there for a second and let's get this thing. So I think he's defined it. Mr. Singh has defined these three kind of the troika of objectives, right? The research, outreach, the academia. How would you see it from the academic point of view, and whether or not this actually connects with the real world?
So, you know, we have a belief that even to be a good teacher, it helps if you are a good researcher. It helps you remain more contemporary with what's happening. It also helps you have more meaningful insights into the field itself. So there's really no dichotomy between being a good teacher and being a good researcher. That's the first point. The second point is the very interesting question you raised about the nature of the research you do. Now, it is possible, though it doesn't always happen, that you can have research which is both impactful and advancing the field. And I think one of the challenges before us academics is to try and choose problems and research contexts that allow us to do that. Professor Andrew Van de Ven at University of Minnesota has this nice model which he calls engaged scholarship, where he says that engaged scholarship comes about when you are working on problems that are relevant, you're bringing very rigorous methodologies to the solution of those problems, and you're even involving the users of that research in the research process. So I think it is possible. It is more challenging, but it is possible to do this. And particularly given the numerous managerial and policy challenges we face in India, I think we should be making a significant effort to do that integration well.
So, is there a sort of admission that there is not enough, and if so, why?
I think there is, there's no secret that the level of research in India in business and management has not been what it should be. I think all of us accept that. However, and the good news is that in the last maybe decade or so, there have been significant efforts to move away from that situation. The institutions have now placed more emphasis on research. Incentive systems within the institutions are beginning to reflect that. And the government, which was, I think, a little skeptical about research to start with, has slowly embraced this as well. You might recall that just a few months ago, the MHRD invited some of the leading ranking organizations in the world, including the Times Higher Education Supplement, to a meeting in Delhi to try and understand why Indian universities and institutions are not ranked better. And the answer they got from THES and others is that it's because you guys don't do enough research. And I think this message has kind of gone home because we do see in many of the statements, both of the ministers and even as high dignitaries as the President of India, that there is now a clear recognition that it's not enough that we just do good teaching, but we need to embrace a strong research culture as well.
Right. So, Mr. Singh, is there also a kind of further compounding of the problem because we are talking about B schools as opposed to, let's say, organization that does scientific research?
No, let me just pick up on Rishikesha's point about the emerging emphasis on research. While that's all very good, the challenge lies in this ranking-driven, search for the holy grail. Now, the problem is that when you load the incentive structures entirely on research, and within that on tenure that is linked with research, you have 2-3 problems arising. One is the whole issue of time. While there may not be a conflict necessarily between research and teaching as a talent, but there is a conflict in terms of time. How much time do you give to research? How much time do you give to teaching? And how much time do you give to doing good for society? There is that tension. Secondly, the research is measured in terms of publications in journals. Those journals are almost entirely Western. In fact, most of them are American. They have their own context, their own preferences, their own problems that they want to focus on. Their own devotion to new knowledge, their own devotion to almost considering applied research as being secondary or inferior. Now, that creates a very perverse incentive to my mind. Because then, that's what naturally the persons who are trying to get tenure, which is the holy grail, are trying to achieve and focus on. That distracts us. The problem again gets compounded even further because, like I said, these journals are Western. So even if it's good research for the Indian context or the Indian accounting rules or the Indian financial system, but it is not relevant or it is not the kind of research that those journals are expecting. So it distracts you from even the quality of research that is relevant for India. It distracts you from teaching. And last but not the least, since the rewards are linked with tenure-related research, it also creates a caste system. Research that is done by other faculty, which is not tenured or is not looking at tenure, and other activities like great teaching, they are not considered as good or as high quality because the rewards are linked with the tenure-related research or academic journal-related research. And that is sending, I think, fairly distorted signals. We do need to, I think, evolve in this country our own homegrown incentive structures. Perhaps our own ranking system, perhaps our own journals, perhaps lobbying with the journals that today matter for Financial Times rankings to make them more accessible more amenable.
But you said that there are still 2 other reasons. So there are still 2 other pillars, right, which you feel an institution like this should focus on.
Absolutely.
And so does this address the concerns that you've raised in the other 2 pillars, including outreach? If
we were to devolve the homegrown systems, it would, because then we would hopefully be able to do engaged scholarship, as Rishikesh mentioned. That's what the need of the hour is. When we say engaged scholarship, it will hopefully be a scholarship that is engaged with society, engaged with students, and creates the kind of scholarship which benefits both pure
So
research.
would that also be a way of defining what you feel the missing link is today? The term engaged scholarship?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think what the missing link is engaged scholarship.
Okay.
Follow the problem rather than follow the journal.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Right.
Professor Krishna, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think I would broadly agree with Pradeep, except that I think there's a couple of things that's happening that is making the situation less adverse than Pradeep perhaps implied. The first thing is that even the journal editors of these gatekeeper journals are becoming more interested in what is happening broadly in emerging economies. And if you just look at the pantheon of journals, you will find that there have been several special issues on emerging market related research issues. So I think the openness...
I mean, we are sitting here in
Yes.
an emerging market
Conference,
yeah.
So I think the openness of the journals to the kind of research which we might be interested in doing has certainly gone up. That doesn't mean that they have removed the lens they used to look at the research, but it at least means they're open to listening to people from countries like India. The second important thing I would say there is that we do have some evidence that it is possible to pursue this kind of engaged scholarship. And I'd like to give you a small example. So one of my colleagues at IIM Bangalore, Professor J. Ramachandran, he started a research agenda about 5 or 6 years ago, trying to understand Indian business groups and how they create value for their owners and shareholders.
Or not,
as the case may be. And in the West, there has been a traditional notion that conglomerates and family business groups are value eroding, and therefore there's been a lot of emphasis on stick to your knitting. This has been questioned, of course, by the success of Korean and other firms, but still there is a lot of suspicion of business groups in the West. So Professor Ramachandran and some of his students, who are now faculty members in their own right, have been trying to look at this area. And just to cut a long story short, they have one core paper on this which has recently been accepted in the Strategic Management Journal, which is the top journal in the strategy field. And in the latest issue of Harvard Business Review, the December 2013 issue, there's actually a piece that they have written based on their work, which is more focused on the manager. Now, this is the first paper, to my knowledge, written by Indian academics in India to appear in HBR.
and on an Indian situation.
And this to me reflects an openness even of practitioner-driven outlets like HBR to the kind of work we are doing in India. So this just gives me a little hope and optimism that as long as we do good work, we are able to present it in a form that is not of interest only to Indian readers but to a larger audience, we can actually practice this kind of engaged scholarship that I was mentioning earlier.
Right.
And I think we need to strategically build on this, engage with those gatekeeper journals, as he calls them, and make them more and more open. And I understand China is investing very substantially in building those bridges with these journals. Chinese research is finding way into these journals. They invite those journal editors, they wine and dine them, they come and lecture, and we need to do that relationship building.
Right.
The one other recommendation that I would make, however, is that we also need to become far more open to recognizing that there are multiple objectives, they will require multiple skill sets and multiple aspirations, and assemble, therefore, a diversity of human resources in our institutions, and not be too doctrinaire or too dedicated or devoted to the tenure track just because that's the American way of doing things. I think we need to assemble people who are terrific researchers and are therefore on tenure track, and there are people who are terrific teachers,
Right.
and there are people who are terrific appliers of research, if you like, who have the ability to sense the market and work.
So,
with
what's the
market.
transmission from here to, let's say, either doing good to society or helping businesses or managers perform better in their environments?
Sorry?
What's the transmission? As in, how do you see all this getting transmitted to the real world where real managers could learn from this and actually apply it to their...
Well, certainly as far as schools of business are concerned, I think we need to first of all consciously and substantially invest in doing need assessments. You know, being more outward looking and allowing us to pick up what is it that the world is looking for today. I mean, today, for example, in India, FDI and all the issues related to that is a big issue. Financial innovation and new products and long tenor funding for infrastructure projects and so on is a major issue. Capital markets are not deep enough. Debt markets particularly are not deep enough. So I think we should work on these kind of issues. 3 years later, the flavor will change. And there's nothing wrong. There's no shame in admitting that the society expects different kinds of expertise. So we are shifting gears. And therefore, we need to have the kind of skill sets and human resources available that are able to make these moves, are nimble enough and don't get too entrenched in taking positions and are interested in doing, they don't see this as prostitution, if I may say so.
Right.
And they see it as being relevant.
Right.
If I can just add something here. So I think one part of translation is, of course, executive education. I think that's one mode business schools use to diffuse what they have learned and what they have researched. Well, some of it goes into the MBA program, but often the immediate application happens when you engage with executives because they're already out there in the field of practice and they can apply those ideas. Even in the US, there have been some changes in the way business schools work. So if you look at some of the most successful business schools now, they really have two sets of faculty. I mean, they have one set of faculty who is the tenure track faculty who Pradeep was just mentioning. And there are the adjuncts who essentially are people who are often from the world of practice or could be academics as well, but who have decided to focus more on teaching rather than on research. So there is a kind of two-horse kind of system going on there. But of course, there are tensions between both these different parts of the system. Some of the schools have been able to manage those tensions very well. I think Kellogg, which is one of the partner schools in ISB, is one of the schools which has managed the whole process extremely well. But others have struggled. And maybe even in India, we need to figure out some of these mechanisms so that we can both retain and motivate people who might be wanting to focus on teaching, but also have a critical mass of people who are working on research. Because I think for the Indian education system as a whole, if we want respect from the rest of the world, if we want to be able to get into collaborations with other people on an equal footing, we must have our own body of research and knowledge, which we can say, proudly say this is our own. Without that, I found that you're really not treated on the same level as other schools.
Right.
So simply for our own self-respect and to be able to build those collaborations, I think we do need to be willing to focus a significant amount of energy on research.
Okay, so is that a fair point,
I think
Mr.
so.
Singh? Because where we are in the chronology of events, maybe we need to invest a little more in research so that there is acceptance and then teaching and then outreach.
And also assemble a two-horse driven cart which is going to get us there.
So just to come back to your original point, right? You said that you saw a gap and in the way, let's say, you would like to see a sort of a synchronicity of these three objectives that you mentioned versus what's actually happening, right? So what in your mind needs to be done first? I mean, what's the way to kick this whole thing off?
No, I don't think there is a particular sequence here that I see. I think all of these things need to be done. There are terrific teaching institutions which are not doing much research. They need to be moving in. I think it's driven by the context as far as the country is concerned. And there are terrific institutions which are very invested in research, but they need to become a little more open to doing a diversity of things in order to achieve all the three objectives.
So, okay, last question really to both of you. So, who finally decides? Is it the market which decides whether you're fulfilling the role that either you set out for yourself, or the potential student thinks that you will do, or is it someone else?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, and I think eventually the market and the government in our country, all right, it's going to be a mix of the two, and the two can very often be in direct conflict. Don't forget that. I think a combination of these two, ultimately the rupee matters, and when I say the market, it's the financer. I mean, at the end of the day, student fees are becoming more and more important, and thank God for that, I think, because it's going to require the institutions to respond to the student requirements. The industry is becoming, in the Indian School of Business is a great example of how industry got together. They are flexing their muscles in terms of what happens. The government, of course, is traditionally the muscle flexor. So I think it's all of these coming together who are going to, and then there is obviously the stakeholders, the faculty, for example. They have their own interests and aspirations and their own views on these matters. They have a very strong voice, but they will respond to incentives. So I think it's really, at the end of the day, a question of getting our incentives right, as is often the case.
Okay, Professor?
Yeah, I think the driver of this is partly going to be the economics of higher education. You might have been following the debate in some of the Western press. For example, in The Economist, there was an article about a year ago about how higher education is not going to continue to be viable in its present form. So as you know, higher education costs in the US, for example, somewhat like US healthcare, have been kind of continuously increasing. And one of the reasons people attribute to this continuous increase in costs is the current model of how faculty members work. So obviously, if faculty members are spending a lot of time on their research, it also means that they're spending relatively less time on teaching. And yet, the university has to run large teaching programs if it is to survive as a financial entity. So that means that they have to hire other people to teach, like adjuncts. And it also means that to cover all these costs, they keep on increasing the fees. And it's kind of reaching somewhat alarming proportions in a market like the US. Even in India, we have seen that high quality education can become quite expensive. So I think there are going to be some challenges, and if there is any disruptive force from outside that sort of pokes at the core of this economics, and people have been talking a lot about your MOOCs and things like that. If these actually manage to poke a hole in that economics of higher education, then higher education as we see it today is going to face very severe challenges. So far it hasn't quite happened, but it could happen as people refine the MOOCs model and make it better and so on. And that's why we see, particularly in the West, many of the universities now sort of, at least taking some tentative steps to get into the MOOC space as well. So I think in short, the challenge to the way higher education is at present is going to come from these technological changes, which might question the basic economics of the industry itself.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the market for research is a pretty imperfect one. It's not easy. Research is not a product which can easily be bought and sold. Right. And therefore, there has always been traditionally a need for some form of patronage, if you like, for research, in the belief, in the correct belief that it is good for society. It's a merit good. So you need to. So whether it's the taxpayers' money that's being pumped into research, as we've tried doing in this country, not very successfully, through our chain of laboratories and so on and so forth, or it is the students who are cross-subsidizing research, as happens increasingly now. Or it is industry and philanthropy, which comes with research grants, which I think is the third element, is what I think we need to be focusing on in this country as well. We don't have a tradition of giving for research. We don't have a tradition for research grants very much. I mean, I heard yesterday that Nestle invests $1 billion in fundamental research on nutrition. I mean, I find that incredible, actually. And we are so far away from that, and I think that's the other thing we need to be looking at. foundations, philanthropists, industry, in the belief that research is good, research grants. And on the other side, faculty then needs to be incentivized to go look for those research grants, work on them, make the proposals, lobby, market, sell their research abilities.
Right, and really, I mean, say all of this in some ways could sort of take us closer to the engaged scholarship that we had really spoken about. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Good luck.